Hello, everybody. It is December the 25th, 2024, certain day of the year that people associate with a certain birth. And it, of course, is a date getting on towards the end of 2024. And as we stumble towards the end of the year, I've invited a number of old friends of the show on to discuss 2024 and what they expect of 2025. And one of the oldest and closest friends of our show is my old friend Jonathan Rauch. He has a new book coming out next month, Cross Purposes, on American religion and the crisis of democracy, which John will come on the show in January to discuss. John, happy Christmas. You're not much of a believer, are you?
I'm not a believer at all, but I still like Christmas, and I've got my Christmas sweater on.
Well, what could be better than two Jewish atheists meeting on Christmas Day? We should have done it over Chinese food.
I love Christmas. It's a day off without guilt for me.
I can't imagine you ever not being guilty.
Yeah, well, that's true. But then I'm an atheistic homosexual Jew, so that's a lot of burdens.
Yeah, and looking back at 2024, I know that there was an election last month that you certainly think was significant, an election which Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris. What should we make of this election, in your view?
Well, my view of it's a bit counterintuitive, which is that it was a strangely ordinary election in the sense that the voters viewed Joe Biden as a failed president, and they wanted a switch of parties, and they went with Trump. This is the third election in a row in which the public has thrown out the incumbent party, and incumbent parties have been in trouble in elections right through 2024. That was the big theme of global politics, France and Germany, Japan, Britain, on and on, incumbents being thrown out. And that's what happened in the United States. So in that sense, it's less surprising and less significant than people think. Of course, the catch is that the Republican candidate is Donald J. Trump, who is sui generis and very, very different from an ordinary political candidate. So when you have an ordinary election with an extraordinary candidate, you get 2024.
But is he that extraordinary when compared with some of the other authoritarian or illiberal leaders running in Hungary, Italy, India?
Oh, I think so. I think he's his own thing. I mean, yes, there is. Yeah, sure. There's a global wave of sort of right-wing populism, and no doubt. But Trump is so Trumpy, and what can you say? Just yesterday, the headlines floated across that he wants to conquer back the Panama Canal and take over Greenland. Who does that?
Coming back to your analysis of the election, you said that it was an election in which the incumbents were thrown out. There's two ways of reading it. On the one hand, that the Biden administration failed and they got essentially what they deserved. On the other hand, some people might argue that Biden actually delivered. The economy wasn't bad. A lot of his investments in the long term are very significant. Most of the wars wound down. There were no major crises. What's your take on this idea of the Biden administration?
Well, my take is that the second analysis, they'll call it the Andrew Keene analysis, though I don't know if you agree with it, but the Keene analysis is correct. That Biden was a pretty good president, but the people didn't think so. They looked at inflation, which was high under Biden for the first part of his term, and they looked at immigration and the border, which really was chaotic during much of his term. And they also looked at his leadership. He was not good at communicating a vision to the public, and they wanted change. I think he accomplished a lot, actually. I think he was on policy a good president. We all can pick fights with him on this and that. He should have moved faster on Ukraine. The Afghanistan pullout was poorly managed. No shortage of things to criticize. But the public has just been in a mood for change every 4 years. It's getting very hard to govern in America because it's very hard to keep people satisfied.
Let's move. We're going to reverse this. You picked out 6 or 7 high points or low points of the year, and then we're going to switch sides, and you're going to talk about some of my high-low points. You noted the Middle East, which is a broad idea. I mean, it incorporates everything from Iran and Syria to Israel, Palestine, Gaza. It was a year in which Middle East was always one way or the other in the news. What particularly stuck out for you in 2024 about the politics, or perhaps the absence of politics, in the Middle East?
Well, I probably shouldn't have called this Middle East. I probably should have called this axis of resistance. Mid-year, in the middle of 2024, I wrote an article for Atlantic about the axis of resistance. That's Iran, Russia, North Korea, with an assist on and off from China, that were aligning against the United States. And I said that they had a very plausible strategy to roll back the Western alliance and put Western-style liberalism on the back foot. And that is by encircling them and harassing them and just creating an exhausting environment. So Putin would invade Ukraine, and if he can't take it over, he'll just sit there and he'll be there and he'll hammer away at it until the West is exhausted. And Iran will encircle Israel, it'll have Hamas on the west and Hezbollah on the north and Iran on the east, and then Yemen down there in the south, and it'll just encircle it. And in 25 years, the Iranians believed Israel would no longer be able to sustain a liberal democracy. People would basically just leave because they can't afford what it takes to keep up that kind of struggle. Well, that was the middle of 2024. At the end of 2024, Iran's strategy has just come a cropper. Israel primarily, but also the Russians, have rewritten all that with the collapse of the Assad government in Syria, the collapse of Hezbollah, Iran's primary proxy. Israel has neutered the air defenses of Iran, leaving it vulnerable to future attack. The Iranian strategy is in ruins. The Russian strategy, they're making slow but steady gains on the ground, but they're hemorrhaging men and material and becoming a vassal of China. And as Donald Trump enters office, suddenly it looks like the bad guys are doing much less well than they were even 6 months ago. And that's kind of a big deal, potentially.
Does that suggest, John, in 2024, that the paranoia about what you call the axis of resistance or evil, or whatever other term people come up with, was a profound exaggeration? That these are at best paper tigers, even Putin, his failure to hold Syria, the relative weakness of Iran, its inability to really support Hezbollah or confront Israel, suggests that it isn't really an axis of resistance. It's a ragtag collection of failing or failed regimes that America conveniently fetishizes as enemies, but aren't really enemies.
Well, I think Iran and Russia at this point can be fairly characterized as enemies, not China, but I think the other two can. So axis of resistance is their term, not mine. That's what Iran calls it. And it's a pretty good term. No, I think that it was actually pretty accurately assessed because its strength was not overvalued. One of the things Biden administration did right is understand that the way you resist that kind of alliance that's just basically, it knows it can't prevail against the United States in a head-to-head military struggle. So instead, it's just going to light fires wherever it can all over the world and run us ragged. We always knew this was asymmetrical warfare and that this is not a peer-to-peer kind of conflict, as in the Cold War. But we also knew that their strategy was not a dumb strategy, just kind of wear us down over time. So I think we got that about right. I think if, I'm no expert on China, but I'm concerned that if any threat is being overstated, it's actually China.
Yeah, well, you didn't actually include anything on China. Coming back to domestic issues, you've picked a couple of court cases, the E. Jean Carroll case against Trump, and then the cases associated with the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg. Why are these two cases so interesting in 2024?
Well, these were two cases in the New York state courts in which Donald Trump was held accountable, something that the federal system has not been able to do. think it's demonstrably true that Trump broke laws in Mar-a-Lago when he kept papers that didn't belong to him and defied a court order to return them. Instead, he hid them and moved them around. He certainly escaped accountability for the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which he helped to inspire and arguably helped in some ways to organize. But these two judgments in New York State are first. They're momentous. This is a former president of the United States who had to stand trial on a civil trial for defamation because he lied, as the jury ruled, and a criminal trial for essentially tax fraud. So here we have at least two precedents of holding a president into account. Now, I added to my list another item going in the opposite direction, which is the Supreme Court in Trump versus United States made it much harder at the federal level to hold a president criminally responsible, no matter what that president does. And so you've got these counterpoints. You've got the state going one way and the federal government going the other. And I'm not sure how that comes out in 2025 and beyond, but it is a reversal of what we used to think was the way the justice system worked in America, where, the federal government had prevalence.
But it does suggest that law and what some people call lawfare is central to American politics. Another case you bring up, which you think is very relevant in 2024, was the case associated with Chevron, the Loper Bright case. Why is this important?
This was the Supreme Court taking back a doctrine that's been on the books for 40 years, which held that if somebody wants to sue the government for misregulating, the courts are going to give government what's the word? Not the shadow of a doubt. But they're going to give prevalence to the government's interpretation of the statute. And the original reason for that was the courts didn't want to be in the business of second guessing every regulation. So they said, look, if what the government says is reasonable in terms of what Congress intended by the statute, we'll just go with that. Conservatives have never liked that because they thought government bureaucracy was unaccountable and made bad decisions. And they hammered away at that doctrine for 40 years. And the Supreme Court finally overturned it, which means that lots of what were settled regulatory issues may now be coming back before the court. And the courts will now decide whether the agencies have it right. So the courts have arrogated unto themselves a lot of power, which that they did not previously have. There's a related case. It's kind of in the same bundle. I can't remember what it's called. But it also says that the administrative agencies of the U.S. government cannot levy sanctions, fines, and so forth on companies based on administrative laws administrative rulings conducted by those agencies. They'll have to actually go to court and get an Article 3 court, a full dress trial in order to get penalties. And that also is going to weaken the administrative
So dropping all
state.
this legal stuff, a lot of people, nobody likes Chevron. I'm sure even the people who work at Chevron don't like Chevron. Nobody's going to support big oil. I mean, some people might defend big tech or even big pharma. Does this Loper case in particular suggest that Chevron can essentially do whatever it likes? What does it mean, especially for environmental issues?
No, it means that the courts become a lot more central. And it means that now if the environmentalists want to get something done, or for that matter, if Chevron wants to get something done, if it doesn't like a regulation, they're going to have to persuade judges. And that means less power for the federal agencies. This is a big turning point in what has been a multi-decade struggle by conservatives against the so-called administrative state, what they sometimes call the deep state. That's the significance of this. How it all comes out, we don't know. This will also prevent the Trump administration's administrative agencies from doing things that they want to do. They'll have to go to court to get decisions.
How extraordinary is this? I mean, throughout the 20th century, there was always a balance of power, which was always shifting between what some people call the imperial presidency and Congress. and the courts and the administration or the bureaucracy in Washington, the federal bureaucracy. Are these issues, these fights over who controls what, are they in any way extraordinary, or is it just business as usual in an America which the founders designed to balance these powers, and where there's always going to be fights in the gray areas between the centers of power?
Well, in those terms, I think it's the latter. I think this is part of a 200+ year conversation that we've been having in this country about the relative power of different branches of government. In that sense, it's a healthy thing. You know, you may or may not like the outcome, but this is a rebalancing in the direction of more power for the courts and less power for administrative agencies. So, but it's part of a very long-term conversation about where power resides in this country. In that sense, no, it's not shocking. It's not new. It's quite healthy.
I should, and I hope to do a conversation actually with one of your Brookings colleagues about post-Roe America. You didn't include the issue of Roe and abortion. Is this something that we should just ignore? Will historians forget that issue when they look at 2024?
No, my assignment for this particular podcast was to come up with things that were big about 2024. Of course, Roe was overturned 2 years ago, and it had immediate electoral impact. Democrats won a lot of elections they were supposed to lose. And this year, Democrats were supposed to win the presidential election because so many women were going to stream to the polls and vote out their anger on the overturning versus Roe versus Wade. The story about Roe versus Wade and its overturning in 2024 is the dog, of course, that didn't bark. Exactly the opposite happened. Women shifted in the direction of Donald Trump, as everyone else did. So in a way, it's possible that we've already moved into the era, into 2025 and beyond, in which the country is accustoming itself to a new reality. We'll see. But maybe it's big news that in 2024 that there was no backlash at the polls.
Yeah, you're presenting 2024, John, and this isn't a criticism. If anything, it's a compliment. It's a very ordinary year. The Middle East is in flames. Iran is in decline, in retreat. There have been a couple of cases about the power of the president, some pushbacks, then lots of cases in the Supreme Court about the different powers of the agencies. And your final points are about, one, government success, the rebuilding of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, and then the success of SpaceX Starship initiative, Elon Musk's so-called giant chopsticks. Again, a fairly ordinary year where the government did well, private enterprise did well. Another unexceptional year for America where the government sometimes performs and certainly private enterprise often performs.
Well, I can't resist quoting the noted podcaster Andrew Keen, who I think gave the best summary of 2024. It made me laugh out loud, but it's very accurate, which is that 2024 will go down as the year before 2025. And I think that's actually literally true. These things that happened are all important, but none of them are mold breaking in a fundamental way, except maybe the re-election of Donald Trump. Depending on what his administration looks like, that could turn out to be a very disruptive change. So my last two are, I picked them because I think they're going to both be seen as big deals. I picked the Baltimore Key Bridge because so many people spend so much time complaining about our institutions and our government and their inability to get anything right, and they're never ready, and then they're always late or underperforming, and then there's the Inspector General report, which tells us all of the things that went wrong. And we tend to overlook the times when government does something really well. So March 26th at about 1:15 in the morning, a massive tanker collides with the Key Bridge in the harbor in Baltimore, takes down the bridge. The distress call, the Mayday call from the ship goes out, I think it's about 1:26 a.m. This is from the chronology on Wikipedia, but I have no reason to think it's wrong. Within 1 minute, the police on that bridge respond by shutting down the traffic. And as a result of that move, only 6 people died as a result of that bridge collapse. And those people were construction workers on the bridge who did not have time to leave it. 2 people were then rescued in the water. It was supposed to take months to get that channel back open. The Baltimore authorities had a channel open within 3 weeks, and they had the harbor back in business within 12 weeks, in advance of schedules and on budget. The disruptions in the supply chain that were supposed to happen, you never noticed them. The system flowed around them. And so I just look at a case like this and say, shouldn't we pay a little more attention as the year ends to the exceptional service that we can and sometimes do get from the government?
Yeah, and you're not going to get any disagreement from me on that. And then what about the SpaceX chopsticks thing? I mean, we haven't talked about Musk as one of the dominant figures of the year. What does that tell us, especially in the
Well,
context, obviously, of the fact that this was a SpaceX initiative and not a NASA one?
it was breathtaking to me. I'm no scientist, but the idea of retrieving and reusing a booster rocket, this is the giant booster. It's full of fuel. Usually it's treated as disposable until now. What they had to do here was put this thing on autopilot, with all of the massive fuel cargo that it had carried, and guide it down to a safe and slow landing, completely automated, between basically a pair of tweezers on the ground. I mean, the technical difficulty of that is staggering. And having a reusable rocket on what is, by the way, the world's biggest payload carrying rocket into space, this is something I wasn't sure I would ever live to see. And yet it's now been done, and it's been done by a private sector for-profit company, no less. And so again, for kind of the same spirit as my last pick, I look at that and think, we mustn't take for granted the incredible achievements that these institutions in America are racking up.
Yeah, you're being almost too fair, John. Maybe we should switch chairs because I'm not noted for my fairness. You've presented the year in a very balanced way. Lots of promise. You were no great
Can
fan
I
of Donald
add
Trump, of
one?
course, but promise in the Middle East, promise perhaps for American involvement in the Middle East, promise in some respects with the law that the system was able to stand up in part to Trump, promise perhaps in terms of Supreme Court decisions, rebalancing or recalibrating power, promise certainly with the efficiency both of government and private enterprise. So for you, it's been a good year, really, relatively good year.
Well, the election for me is very bad news. I'm worried sick about that for reasons we've discussed in other episodes. Um, but yeah, in other ways, this was a year that showed that just when we think, for example, in the Middle East, that things are settled, that they can be shaken up, and that sometimes the world goes our way. I would add, if you'll permit me, this just little point of privilege. I joined Blue Sky, and pretty much left Twitter. I kept my handle, but I did that in 2024. Blue Sky's public debut, I think, was early in the year. It was in February, and it was a nothing. And maybe it won't amount to anything, but I just want to put a bookmark there, if you will, Andrew, in hopes that Blue Sky might become the social media
What about all the
forum
criticisms
that
that Blue
Twitter
Sky is
failed to
just
be?
as intolerant from the left that Twitter is from the right? Have you noted that, or is that not true?
Well, I'm just such a small player there, but the people I follow are better behaved. Yeah, there've already been problems. A very good journalist named Jesse Singal, who is controversial and disliked on the left because he's written some accurate things about transgender medicine. He's already been brigaded, and they've already put him on block lists. And they're already trying to get him thrown off for hate speech. But Blue Sky did not do that. It let him alone. So we'll see. Social media just tends to curdle so fast. So I'm probably living on cloud nine to hope that blue sky will be better. But I'm just putting a marker
Well,
in
you presented
in hopes.
2024, John, as a relatively forgettable year. Maybe it was a forgettable year. Very briefly before we switched chairs, and you asked me about my take on 2024. What are you expecting from 2025? Very briefly. I mean, we'll probably do more shows on that in 2025.
In terms of foreign policy, I'm expecting that things will turn out a little bit better under Trump than I had feared. I'm now at this point, I'm no longer thinking that he's going to pull the rug out from under Ukraine instantly and annihilate NATO instantly. I think there are now real opportunities in the Middle East to strike some deals and make some bargains. Iran is much weaker than it was before. And I think actually he might be able to wheedle some kind of interesting deal out of Putin. On the domestic front, I think he'll be worse than we thought. His appointments have taken no notice of precedent, qualifications, competence in the power agencies. I mean, the FBI, for example, and Homeland Security and DOJ. So at the domestic front, we may see a move in the direction of Hungary. So, but I don't know. He's so unpredictable, Andrew.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if you and I have talked about this Hungarian thing, but I think comparing America and Hungary is, to say the least, absurd. But perhaps we might switch seats. I know that I have a couple of thoughts on 2024. So do you want to? I'm going to join us up video wise. So maybe John, you can take me to task on 2024.
Well, you've got 6 items on your list. I characterized the 2024 election as a surprisingly ordinary election, albeit with an extraordinary Republican candidate. You characterized the election as a catastrophe for Biden and Harris and a crisis for the Democrats. Why do you read it in such unprecedented hair on fire terms?
Because I think the election reflected an idea. I don't know whether I would call it ideological crisis for the Democrats, both in the sense that Biden was clearly unfit to be president in the last couple of years of his administration, and the Democratic Party failed to acknowledge it, failed to tell the truth. The media failed to tell the truth. So we had a president who was barely coherent, which got manifested in the debate with Trump, where then he was eventually forced out of the race. So I think in that sense, it reflected something very troubling, that a party would not reveal that the emperor was naked, or that the emperor was, if not suffering from Alzheimer's, certainly not competent or capable of being president. Who knows who was running or who is running the Biden presidency, but it's certainly not Joe Biden. And I think that Kamala Harris, I know everyone will say, oh, she did as well as she could. She was put in an impossible situation. I mean, obviously those things are in some senses true, although if it was such an impossible situation, she shouldn't have run. She should have said, I'm not doing it. I think she was a catastrophic candidate in the sense that she had no explanation of why she wanted to be president. I think that the campaign was a farce, all this happy talk, no coherent idea of what she was going to do with the country. Deeply conservative. And the Democrats have become an incredibly conservative party. And they've left open the opportunity for Republicans to begin to address the structural crises in this country, whether they're the problems with government, healthcare, foreign policy, the immigration issue. They're not willing, the Democrats, for one reason or another, to address these crises, these problems. They behave, and Kamala Harris in particular, behave as if everything is rosy in the American garden, and that we should celebrate being American, and we should just continue to do what we've been doing. So for me, it's really depressing to have a party, supposedly a progressive party, supposedly a party on the left, that has fundamentally failed to address the challenges and opportunities for 21st century America. And they've left it to Trump to appoint people like RFK Jr. and Elon Musk to address these issues. It will force, I think, 2025 onwards, this next Trump administration will force the Democrats to address this, force new language, new candidates. I mean, the fact that you have this absurd gerontocracy of Biden and Pelosi also is deeply depressing. So for me, 2024 was more interesting. I'm not particularly interested in Trump. He's an annoying character. I don't think he has much historical significance. But I am very troubled with the direction of the Democratic Party. Fundamentally, they're incapable of taking risks. It's become a deeply conservative technocratic party, unwilling to take risks, unwilling to offer the electorate any real dramatic choices. So I have no idea of what will happen in 2025 onwards, but something has to happen. This party cannot continue to be so conservative and so unwilling to take risks. And they need candidates.
Yeah,
And
well,
I think people won't like hearing this, but I think I'm trying to write a book about America. I think the most successful candidates, progressive candidates, are American aristocrats. The families that have done the most to change America were the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. And you need aristocracies on the left to change anything. It's becoming increasingly clear that privilege is essential to have a progressive administration. And Democrats are not, I mean, it's publicly probably a rather unsavory thing to acknowledge, but I just think it's true. And the last great hope for reforming America was Bobby Kennedy. This was more than 50 years ago. And he was a great hope because he was willing to take risks. FDR was willing to take risks. But these were people from privileged backgrounds, and perhaps it requires privilege to take risks. So I know it's a rather unsavory, elitist thing to say, but I can say it on my own show. No one's going to throw me up.
Well, I have no problem with elitism, but I do wonder if times have changed too much. But from your point of view,
but coming
Andrew,
back to that, I mean,
you,
and for me, the big villain of 2024 was Michelle Obama. I think it's unconscionable that she didn't run. I mean, if everyone says, my wife says to me, well, she doesn't like politics, blah, blah, all the rest of it. But she was willing to talk at the convention. She was willing to give the speeches she wanted to give. I think she has a moral responsibility to America to run, and she failed to do it, which again reflects the selfishness of the progressive elite, that they're willing to do the talk, but not actually walk it through. And she should have just run. The progressives they need some degree of celebrity. The American system is a monarchy or a neo-monarchy. And the kind of people they produce, like Harris, are parliamentary leaders.
From your point of view, I'll press you on this just for a moment before we pass on. But from your point of view, mightn't one say that the election was healthy for Democrats? If Harris had eked out a victory, a very narrow victory, from your point of view, we would have seen 4 more years of the same creaky, conservative, risk-averse, and basically failed kind of government. Now there's a chance for renewal.
Yeah,
right?
and that's a good point. No, I agree. I mean, it's the old Leninist argument of, you got to fail to win, or you need to destroy stuff. And but we'll see. I mean, I don't know where the initiatives come from. I mean, people talk about AOC, I mean, Bernie Sanders. There needs to be some new way of doing politics on the left, new way of thinking about politics. And they need to liberate themselves from the nostalgia of the New Deal. You can't go back to the New Deal. And that was the problem with Biden, is he basically had no ideas apart from going back to government investment in the private sector, in initiatives, in innovation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But apart from that, he was bankrupt of ideas.
One of your other choices surprised me, actually, because it strikes me as a flash in the pan and a big media fuss. But this is Luigi Mangione and JFK Jr. and the politicization of healthcare. Now Mangione is, he's apparently somewhat demented 20-something who got some strange ideas into his head and killed someone, and this has been turned into a cause célèbre about some sort of judgment on our healthcare system, and that struck me as more an online phenomenon than anything very real. What did you have in mind when you put this and JFK Jr. on your
Well, I
list?
think I'm guilty of going for the later stories, so probably I forgot everything that happened in the first 11 months of the year, and I can only remember what happened in December. But I think the Mangione case is an interesting one in the sense I always think that America, the fundamental fact of America in the 21st century is the enormous inequality, the privilege of the elite class, which isn't, and then maybe this comes back to my point about the Kennedys and FDR, is not reflected in political terms. So politics is not, we're not seeing the consequence, the political consequence of America's socioeconomic structure. And I think in some ways, 21st century America resembles 19th century Russia in that inequality. And I think that Mangione maybe is crazy, but he has a lot of supporters. And I think his behavior resembles the kind of simplistic moralism of late 19th century Russian anarchism, where the privilege.
Yeah, or maybe U.S. anarchism. We saw
Yeah,
the
I mean,
same
but in
phenomenon in the
particular in
U.S.
Russia, which was
McKinley was shot by
19th
an
century
anarchist.
Russia, which was a much more hierarchical, inegalitarian society, where morality was simplified by this elite who often weren't working to distinguish between good and evil, and enabled people like Mangione to go out and assassinate people who they thought was bad. Now, you're right. I mean, the guy clearly was a little loopy, but the fact that he's elicited so much support does suggest that that this fall back to violence, I think perhaps, and maybe it touches on another of the issues, that the universities these days and the younger generation have a very simplistic moral code. And the fact that he was able to justify his own violence, I hope is not the case, but might suggest something rather chilling for the future.
Well, let's go to that. You also included Gaza and the intellectual and economic crisis of U.S. universities. Here's one of those areas where, I could pull an Andrew Keen and say, well, sure, but what's new about university students being moralistic and simplistic and not knowing what they're talking about, not even being able to find on a map the place that they're
Yeah.
protesting about? I mean, what prompts you to think that that's an important development in 2024?
I think it's important. I mean, you're right in the sense that obviously the university campuses have always been places of great controversy and demonstrations, especially since the 1960s. But I think it also reveals, I think the two areas of America that are most ripe for reform are the healthcare system, which we talked about a little bit, and the JFK initiative or Junior, and the dysfunctionality of the university system. So the interesting thing about the university crisis and the Gaza crisis is it resulted in these administrations coming under more and more fire, the quitting of university presidents, and more people questioning the whole point of university and certainly the cost of university. I mean, you don't have any kids. I've just put 2 kids through college, spent enormous amounts of money. And in my mind, it's not entirely clear what I or my kids got in return. And I think that's true of the entire generation. So I think that the crisis over, Gaza, Israel, and all the demonstrations perhaps points to a deeper structural crisis within the university, particularly perhaps in the context of AI and the fact that this information class is coming under more and more pressure from digital networks and perhaps in the long run being made redundant. So I think it's the opening salvo in the longer term crisis of the university. I mean, there's always a crisis, and whenever anyone talks about universities, they're always in one kind of crisis or another. But I think these are more structural forms of crisis. I mean, do you not agree with that?
Yeah. Well, I take your point actually now that I think I understand it better, which is that what's new and interesting isn't the fact of the protests and their simple-mindedness and ill-informed moralism, but the public reaction to that, which is people are no longer giving universities the same benefit of the doubt. Here's something I should have
Yeah,
put on
yeah, and
my
I think
list.
that this also touches on Mangione, who again might be a disturbed young man, but he's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. He was the top student of his year at the top private school in Baltimore. He is supposedly the model of the American student, and look how quickly he fell from that into justifying the assassination of a corporate leader who he didn't approve of.
Well, here's an event which should encourage you, which should have been on my list. In 2024, the University of Austin, a brand new
Yeah, where
startup
I've been, you
university.
introduced me actually, and we had a couple of interviews with.
Yeah, you did some good shows from there. They introduced, right actually as you were interviewing, they introduced their first freshman class, and they are trying to build a new model of a university, which will focus more on citizenship. The curriculum will be different, innovative. The first 2 years will be great books, but the second 2 years will be practicums about learning real world skills. And that's interesting. I think maybe that's a sign of the fact that people are now willing to experiment with new models, and the Ivy League sacred cows are being slaughtered. How about one that we have in common is the what I talked about, the Middle East, the axis of evil. I view those as changes in which we have seen our geopolitical opponents on the run unexpectedly. You called it the new nature of evil. What do you see happening in the Middle East and with Putin and so forth?
This might sound a little naive, but I was struck by I'm struck by two things on the Assad Russia thing. I was struck with firstly how evil the Assad regime is. I mean, it was evil in a couple of ways. Firstly, it was a mass murdering state. I mean, maybe not on the scale of Pol Pot's Cambodia, but certainly in that league. So I think it was a profoundly evil state, and it was a state whose economy, if that's the right word, rested on drug production. So I think there's something particularly unique about the Assad regime, and I don't think we're celebrating its fall as much as we should. Everyone's worried now about the renaissance of Al Qaeda, and if that's the case, then I would certainly prefer Al Qaeda to Assad. But secondly, I'm also struck by the fact that the Russians supported them. I mean, the Russians, Assad fled to Moscow, and there was a headline this morning that the Kremlin denies reports that Assad's wife had filed for divorce. It just struck home to me, and again, maybe this isn't news for everyone else, but the fundamental amorality of Putin's Russia, that they would be willing to prop up a state that I don't really even understand what the strategic value is. I mean, I don't think Russia is particularly interested in Israel one way or the other. They've got bigger fish to fry in Ukraine. Why the Russians or why the Russian Secret Service would support such an evil regime? I mean, they didn't support Pol Pot's Cambodia. Again, I can't remember the details of that, whether Mao supported Pol Pot's Cambodia. But what would, maybe this is the wrong way of putting it, but how bad a regime would you need for the Russians to say, actually, no, thank you, we don't want to be involved with these people. They're too bad.
Well, I think that's part of Putin's point, really, is he cultivates an image as a kind of bad boy of international politics, the guy who will do what it takes. Don't even think about opposing him because you will end up thrown out a window or your country will be conquered. And he was, I think, partly making that point in Syria. Of course, he also got a warm water port. That's useful to him. But part of what's so interesting about the collapse of Assad is it's also the collapse of the Russian effort to prop him up. It just fell apart. They weren't there when he needed them. Assad was calling Putin for help, and Putin stopped answering the phone.
Yeah, I agree. And as I said earlier, I think it reflects the fact that the Russians are a rather pathetic regime, but I think also morally pathetic. I'm not sure who runs their secret services, But that you have to assume that there are people in Moscow who are thinking to themselves, why are we supporting such pure evil? Why would we support a regime which manufactures all the drugs for the Middle East and murders its own domestic population, is a sectarian regime, it has no ideology, doesn't have any interest in Russia one way or the other. So I don't know, we'll see. But at some point, I think those issues will get addressed in Moscow. I think it really, to me, just underlined how rotten Putin is. I've always been slightly ambivalent about the Putin haters in the West, but this made me recognize what a bad man he is, or what a bad regime he's running. And the Assad regime is truly, as I said, I mean, it's truly evil. And that word gets used all the time. And I'm no great defender of Israel or Netanyahu, but when you compare Assad and Netanyahu, it does bolster the Zionist argument that for all the quote unquote crimes of Israel, they're incomparable with what's happening in places like Syria.
Hafez al-Assad wiped out an entire city, just wiped it out, leveled it to the ground.
And that was the father, and the son is even worse.
That was the father. Well, he's less competent at it, so take that for what it is. But yeah, it is bracing to be reminded of the existence of, no kidding, old-fashioned, plain old evil.
And I also think that the fall of Syria has been treated, it has been very poorly covered. I mean, very little discussion on the Alawite community, on the sectarian nature of it, of these new forces, and whether it's essentially a Shia organization. So I would like to see, and maybe that reflects the crisis of the American press, that even newspapers like the New York Times seem to invest a lot more money in covering Trump than they do in Syria.
You mentioned a couple of tech stories, or tech-related stories. One is the TikTok ban and hostility to China, and the other, I'll bracket these together because it seems to me that they overlap, at least culturally, and the other is the arrival of Silicon Valley billionaires in Washington, D.C. as consultants in government, shadow cabinet members. I'm not quite sure what they are. What is your thinking about these developments, perhaps starting with TikTok?
I think actually they're very different. I'm horrified with the TikTok developments. The fact that there seems to be consensus almost on left and right that America or the courts or the administration has the right to ban TikTok for no coherent reason. And people say, well, the Chinese are getting all this data. I don't know what data they're getting. I don't know if the kids on TikTok who are putting their photos up of dancing bears, I don't see what benefit that does to Beijing. But I find it profoundly disturbing that there's no debate about this. There's more debate about Israel, or certainly more obsession with Trump. But no one's actually addressing the fact that the Americans are choosing to ban a dominant popular media because it's owned by a foreign power that we don't like. I think there's also a generational quality. If I'm a young person on TikTok, I'd be very disturbed. I mean, I'm more likely perhaps to demonstrate over that than I would over Gaza. So it seems to be a very underrepresented. I'm astonished with the fact that it hasn't elicited more debate, that nobody seems to want to defend TikTok. And there is this new atmosphere, this new Cold War atmosphere, where there's consensus on left and right that the Chinese are the enemy, and everything we do to challenge them, to push back, is a good thing, and that we have every right to ban one of their media companies that, for better or worse, has had enormous success in America. So I find it very chilling that there's so little debate about it. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Do people debate it in DC, or when you show up at Brookings and when you do your dinner parties with all your fancy friends, is anyone willing to criticize the government over TikTok, whether it's Biden or Trump?
Well, I wish I had fancy friends in
less
dinner
fancy
parties,
friends or
but my unfancy friends, there is a healthy debate over the legality of this move. Not so much, you're correct, the foreign policy aspect, whether TikTok is dangerous. There is a widely shared assumption that having 100 million Americans carrying around a device which is transmitting directly potentially they claim to the Chinese Communist government is not a good thing. So now the government has not established that that's in fact what's happening. They haven't even, as I understand it, established that that's likely or even possible to happen. But a lot of fire is being held until we hear how this plays out in the court. And I think the expectation is we'll know a lot
Yeah, and
more
Trump is
once we
in
hear the
his
Supreme
classically
Court verdict.
Trumpian said it might be worth keeping TikTok in the US for a little while, which means he will take advantage of this situation to benefit himself. But
Yeah.
um,
I will say for what it's worth that I share the direction of your reaction, which is that this move does seem awfully precipitous based on the evidence that we've
and
actually
it also
seen.
speaks of the death, at least in 2024, of globalization. That in this post neoliberal world is that everyone's given up on globalization, people both on the left and the right. And this probably is reflected in the collapse of your old wing of the Republican Party, or certainly Pete Wehner's wing, the Cheney wing of the Republican Party. There's this ideological recalibration in the parties. And there doesn't seem to be any natural constituency to talk about TikTok and say, hold on, why are we banning foreign media companies? It's exactly what we criticize the Chinese for doing, for not allowing Facebook or Google in their country. And we're doing exactly the same thing.
I wonder what your kids have to say
Yeah,
about
my
it.
kids
What
certainly my son's not interested in TikTok. I don't think my daughter is either. But if I was part of that generation and I was a user of TikTok, I'd be really disturbed. I mean, it'd be interesting to see if it is indeed shut down, how these kids will respond, whether they'll just simply go to Threads or Blue Sky or X or Instagram and not really care one way or the other. I mean, and how it will be explained to them that they can't use this service because the Chinese government might find out what they had for breakfast.
Well, I think one reason you haven't heard more reaction from your Washington friends and contacts, there's several. One is people are overwhelmed with Trump. He's just throwing everything at everybody all at once. But another is I'm not sure people really fully believe the Supreme Court will allow this to stand. They may allow some of it to stand, but I think TikTok will go to the court with a pretty strong case that this is an overbroad and poorly founded decision. But we'll see. What about
And just
the,
to come back on that, I mean,
Elon?
that's something that we will be avidly looking at 2025. I'm not always someone who spends a lot of time reading or thinking about the Supreme Court, but I think they have, and I use this word carefully, a responsibility to enable foreign media companies to exist in America. Otherwise, America really becomes like Hungary, and you can't blame Donald Trump for that.
Well, and this court has been very protective of free speech,
Right.
and it has been for quite some time. But what's your thought about, Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency? And I see Mark Andreessen just gave a 2-hour interview to Barry Weiss, which I listened to avidly, in which he said basically that people who don't think they'll be able to do much with this commission are naive and underestimating how much you can change things through sheer will and determination. What do you make of all that?
Well, I think this comes back to my original point about the Democratic Party and not willing to acknowledge these new structures of power, the new challenges and opportunities. And it also speaks to my point about Mangione and the profound inequalities, the socioeconomic structure of America, where you have this new techno elite, the Silicon Valley elite, enormous power and money, which never got manifested in politics. It was always a bit surreal that these people were happy in their fancy homes in Palo Alto, but they didn't show up in Washington, D.C. Now we have that reality with the second Trump regime, that Andreessen and Musk and Sachs are showing up in D.C. and they want to change America for better or worse. And I would include RFK Jr. in this, that all the reformist initiative, and a lot of it is coming from Silicon Valley, an efficiency initiative, a kind of extreme utilitarian thinking, is arriving in Washington, D.C. And for me, and that comes back to your point earlier, that's why 2025 and probably 2026, 2027 are going to be really interesting, because this is when the rubber really meets the road, and we'll see whether these ideas can actually play out, or whether your town, Washington, D.C., will just kind of eat up these people and we'll have bureaucratic confusion. I'm not sure. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that based on Mark Andreessen's 2-hour interview, that he's a brilliant man and out of his depth when it comes to Washington. Now, I sit, the belly of the beast at the Brookings Institution, the 12-year-old or whatever think tank. So I would say that. But to change government, you're going to have to change laws. You're going to have to go to Capitol Hill and get a bunch of things passed. That's very hard to do. Every single one of these programs that they say is wasteful or inefficient has a constituency. It's got a lobby. It's going to take them to court. So I'm concerned that what they'll do is set up voters and perhaps even Andrew Keene for expectations that they won't be able to meet, and the result will be even more cynicism about government. I think the way you change government is the unglamorous but slow and steady way of just hammering away at making things better by passing bills through subcommittees and committees and making things work better. But that's maybe they'll do that. We'll see. What do you make of Silicon Valley's? Maybe this is a wrong way to think of it, Andrew, but I remember, the early days of Silicon Valley, they didn't want to have anything to do with Washington. They just wanted to be left alone. Facebook didn't even have, as I recall, or maybe it was Google, a Washington office. They just, that's over there. We're not doing that. We're busy over here innovating. And now we see something more like the opposite, don't we? Where they're turning their attention heavily toward Washington. They're diving into it in a way that must have some reputational and business risks.
I think the Silicon Valley response to that would be that we wanted to be left alone by government to do our thing, to invent our companies, to found companies and new technologies, but the government wouldn't leave us alone. There was too much regulation, antitrust initiatives, that the government was interfering. So we were forced into this situation. I think that would be the standard Andreessen-Musk response, the Sachs response. I would argue that, again, it's a recalibration of reality. You can't have all the economic power in a country. I mean, when you add up, I think, the wealth of whatever it is, the 6 or 7 top tech companies, it makes up whatever it is, 15 or 20, 25% of the Dow Jones, of the entire economy. What we're seeing is a recalibration of power. Economic power is meaningful. It's not something that can just exist in Palo Alto and the rest of America goes on as normal. So I think your point of just Andreessen doesn't understand government. He's a smart man, but he's out of his depth, and he should leave politics to Washington, D.C., where things like the Francis Scott Key Bridge Initiative will always continue to exist, and he should be in the business of making money. I don't think that's the case. I think that this new money, this new imbalance of power, these new elites are going to fundamentally change America. And it comes back to my point again about the Democratic Party, is they're not willing to acknowledge that. They refuse to look the monster in the eye and say, this is the nature of America, and we have to rethink ourselves. So the Republicans have taken the initiative. I have a guy coming up on the show. I think you may have watched him before. He's written 2 wonderful histories of liberalism and conservatism. Edmund Fawcett, he used to be the Economist guy in Washington, D.C. And in his book on conservatism, he argues, his history of conservatism, he argues that in the modern age, it's always the conservatives who make the first move. And I think what you're seeing with Trump and JFK Jr. and Andreessen and Musk is the first move of a new chess game, a post-neoliberal game. We don't even have the language to describe it, but it's a new game. You may want to go back to the old game, but that old game doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what the new game is, but it's new.
The problem will be it's not so much that you're wrong, it's that the old game is still there. It's embedded in the Constitution and the structure of government and the administrative agencies, in the courts and the law and the, what is it, 80,000 pages of Federal Register that's published every year. You can't wish it away. But one thing you say is very right. But I think it's worth just pausing as we go into 2025 to notice there's nothing new about corporate leaders and tycoons getting involved in Washington policy, but there was a traditional way to do that, which is you hire a bunch of lobbyists and you get an office on K Street, and then you wine and dine government officials and you make campaign contributions and you sneak stuff into appropriations bills that no one knows is there to help your industry. And what this group is doing is different and in some ways more public spirited. They are saying they're taking a very high profile role. They're saying, screw all that. We're just going to come in
Right.
at the topmost level and we're going to try to reform the whole thing. I think it's naive, but I also think it's fundamentally, in some sense, public
Although
spirited.
you're right in a way, but I think their notion of the public space is very different. I mean, the old way was the Carnegie way, which Bill Gates has modernized, of spending half your life amassing a huge fortune and the second half giving it away to what you call the public good. But Andreessen and Musk and maybe even Bezos are not willing to do that. And it may be because they have more power and more money. I think the other thing that is different today, I don't know the economic numbers. We need to get an economist like Emmanuel Saints on the show. But Musk is worth several $100 billion, depending on the share price of Tesla. And a lot of people have suggested that he would be the first $1 trillion man. These individuals now have way more economic power than previous wealthy individuals, the Carnegies, the Stanfords, even the Bill Gateses of the world. So we're entering a new age where somebody like Musk thinks of himself as the state. So for investing, he can invest 40 billion in Twitter so that he can just transform it into his own public square where he can broadcast his own ideas.
He can,
and even the economic return,
he can invest 200
it's neither
million
here
in
nor
a
there for him. He
presidential
doesn't
campaign.
care. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting year, John. We will talk more. I mean, all the things we're talking about are longer term issues. We got to deal with a Trump administration, but we will see you in late January, because I know you've got this new book coming out, which called Cross Purposes, which addresses religion and American democracy. So lots to talk about in 2025. Thank you so much for your support for the show. You've always been a wonderful guest, and I appreciate you turning the tables and asking me the tricky questions too. So Happy New Year, John. Happy Christmas, and we will see you in the new year.
Bye-bye. Thank you.